When Hannah and I got married, we moved into an apartment, and I'm a believer that there's a benefit to not having everything you want when you first start out. You know, some people, move into this great big house, have this awesome job, and that's how life begins. Our apartment was wonderful, but it was tiny. I think it was smaller than this whole stage. Probably not. It might have been a little bigger than that. But it was shaped in a horseshoe. And so you walk in and you go to it was a living room, dining room, kitchen combo, essentially. And the kitchen was just a strip of cabinets on the wall with like a 1.5 foot linoleum strip. That was the kitchen, and then the dining room and the living room, and so our dining room table kind of functioned as the coffee table at the same time, right? That's kind of how it was. And then you kind of go on the bend of the horseshoe, and there was a hallway that had just a closet. That was it, just a whole closet. And if one person was looking in the closet, the other person couldn't walk by down on the hallway. And then at the end of the hallway was the bathroom, and there was a tub. But if somebody was brushing their teeth, nobody else could be in the bathroom at the same time, right? Two people could not brush their teeth together in that bathroom. Then on the end of the curve there was our bedroom. We had a queen-size bedroom, basically just enough that we could walk around the bed. That was the size of the apartment. And some of you are thinking, man, that was bigger than my first apartment, right? But the reality, it was tiny, it was small. I remember when Christmas time came around, we decided we needed a Christmas tree. And we were thinking, okay, what do we want to get? Well, there wasn't room for a very big tree. So we went to the store, got a 3-foot tree, and put it on a basket right in our entryway because we didn't have any other space and couldn't really afford anything bigger than that anyway. But that was our Christmas decorations that year, just that little Christmas tree. And that's how our first year started, and it was wonderful, and it was a great year, but it was a pretty close quarters year. There wasn't really any space to move about. And we all could think back on times like that maybe it wasn't hard, but it wasn't as ideal as we would have liked it. You know, we would have liked a bigger apartment, a bigger house, bigger whatever it is. But sometimes life doesn't always work out that way. And in 2 Kings chapter 4, we encounter someone who's in a very difficult spot. If we encounter this widow who calls out to Elisha, who is the prophet in Israel at that time. And in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 1, we find that this widow was a member, she was a widow, her husband was a member of the group of prophets who worked with Elijah. So she came to Elijah and she cried out and she said, "My husband who served with you is dead, and you know how he feared the Lord. But now a creditor has come threatening to sell my sons as slaves." That's a pretty difficult situation. You know, in one sentence, this woman shares how difficult her life is. Her husband has died. Now that's difficult in and of itself, losing a spouse. But not only that, the husband was the sole breadwinner, I guess you would say, the one who would provide financially for the family. Widows and women in the ancient world didn't have many options in order to actually care for themselves, to provide for themselves, to have the financial means to survive. This woman was a widow. And she cries out to Elijah, and Elijah would have known this man's reputation because this man would have worked with Elijah, was somebody who was with Elijah in an intimate way, a close way. This was not just some stranger, an acquaintance that he had met. This was someone he knew well. And with this man, we know since he died, and unfortunately there is collateral damage sometimes. You know, this man probably lived a good life, dedicated to the Lord, as the woman said, but yet he died. We get the implication that he died earlier than normal, and his family was in a difficult spot. And not only that, now they were in debt. But see, faithfulness to God does not mean prosperity, does not mean safety, doesn't mean that we'll have everything we want. But when this man died, he left debt that his family could not pay. On some level, we may ask ourselves, well, why did he allow so much debt to accrue? Why did he assume so much debt? And we have no context for that. Maybe it was something where he was making an investment that would pay off great later had he not died. We don't know, but we know that the widow, is in just a terrible situation. So the creditors were coming. It's almost as though vultures were flying around in the air, and you say, well, there's a dead carcass. Or they smelled blood in the water because they knew they had an opportunity to really help themselves. The widow really didn't have much of an option, so she calls out to Elisha, telling him what's happening. Now, one of the issues at stake here is the fact that Elisha doesn't have any legal standing against these creditors because the creditors aren't doing anything illegal. Now, they might not really be following the law, they might not be honoring the law, but they're not actually breaking the law. You know, there's a difference between being innocent and not guilty. They were not innocent. They may have been not guilty, but they definitely weren't innocent. See, they were following the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. Because of that, Elijah didn't really have any standing for him to come and tell them what they were doing was wrong. We find in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 39 through 42, it tells us about these types of situations. It says, if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or as a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. At that time, he and his children will no longer be obligated to you, and they will return to their clans and go back to the land originally allotted to their ancestors. The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, so they must never be sold as slaves. So there was the opportunity to become a slave. That was a weird sentence, but if you have debt, you could become a slave to pay the debt, but you could not be sold as a slave to another individual. What's happening here is in Leviticus, it tells us that we need to make sure that we treat each other honorably. It's not about money grabbing. It's not about making sure you get what is yours. What Leviticus is telling us is we need to act like we're part of the family of God because we are the family of God. We need to treat each other honorably. And this applies to the church today as how we interact and treat each other, that we need to treat each other not as slaves, but as family, as friends. These creditors weren't necessarily doing anything against the law, but they definitely weren't following the heart of the law. And we find ourselves in financial difficulties at times. And I remember our first year of marriage was not the most financially lucrative for us. Hannah was a substitute teacher in the school district, and it's a large school district, so she basically worked every single day. We really didn't have any issue there, but, you know, substitute teachers don't get benefits, don't get all these extra things, and so it was a paycheck and see you later type thing. Not that there was any rudeness. I got a job at a bank. I was a part-time teller at what was National City, and it was purchased by PNC. Not that you care to know that, but I just have that knowledge that I needed to get off my chest, apparently. But I was a part-time teller, and it was a great situation, just a nice job for me. I was also a teaching assistant. I was doing a master's program, and part of that program allowed me to be a teaching assistant to get some scholarship money for school. So, but between those things, we were not wealthy. Now, we weren't eating ramen noodles only every night. That's not how we were. But we just didn't have a lot of extra money to throw around. But again, when you're first starting off, that can be a good thing. That can be a good thing, but sometimes, as I said, we find ourselves in difficult financial situations, which is where this widow found herself. So she cries out to Elijah, and he asks her, he says, what can I do to help you? What do you have in the house? She says, nothing except a flask of oil. So Elijah gives her this instruction. He said, borrow as many jars as you can from your neighbors and family. Then go into your house with your sons and close the door. Pour oil from your flask into the empty jars, setting aside each one as it is filled. So Elijah offers to help. Again, we recognize that he had some type of relationship, some history with her husband. So he likely had empathy and cared for the family and wanted to make sure that if he could do anything, he would. He listened to her. Now, if you remember the story, this was in 2 Kings chapter 2. A few chapters earlier, Elijah, with a J, had just been taken up to heaven. He was the prophet of Israel, and Elisha is coming as his successor. And we're kind of getting to the point of, well, is God going to be with Elijah? Is God going to use him? Is he going to be the prophet where God brings miracles into this world? Is God going to bring his word through Elijah? So this was the first big test. The first big time that he was given an opportunity to see, is God going to work through him? So would God be with Elisha like he was with Elijah? That's the question that we're asking ourselves. And he gives this woman the instructions, and he asked her what she had. And this is just so interesting. She identified that she had a flask of oil, just a little bit. Not a huge jar, not a big container, but just a little bit of oil. I think it's really easy when we get into difficult situations to get to the point where we're, woe is me so much that we don't even see that we have anything. But even in desperation, even in the fact of hopelessness, she says, I've got something. And one of the great things about God is that he uses what is available. It's not as though God says, well, we've got to have all these things before I can work. He says, show me what you have. That's what God asks us to do. Show us what we have. So in my opinion, it was important that this woman identified that she had something. Even though it was minimal, even though there wasn't much, even though there was hardly any, she had something and she was able to identify it. And in this time, oil was really important. They used it for cooking. They used it for their lamps to burn, to be able to see. They used it for anything and everything. And she had just a little bit. But she had something and she identifies it. And that's all God needs. He just needs us to give him what we have. And the instructions are as follows: to go to your friends and neighbors and borrow as many jars as you can. Now, I imagine the widow might have been a little confused at that. In fact, I'm not sure her friends and family would have been real excited for that. Knowing that she was very likely going to be sold into slavery soon, if I let you borrow something, the likelihood of me getting it back really decreases. All right, if you're going to move, my chance of letting you borrow something is pretty low, unless it's to help you move. So, but she goes to them, has this conversation. I need these things. The prophet of the Lord has asked me to borrow them from you. She went and she was obedient to what he asked her to do. And what we'll find is that these jars represent the widow's faith. Because in life, your limit of God is your limit of his blessing. When we put God in a box, which we often do, typically the blessing comes in that same box, that same size. When we limit God, we limit what he wants to do in our life. But another part of this moment is we're trying to see what kind of prophet Elisha is and how God will work through him. When you think of a prophet, he was the prophet of Israel, of the whole nation. He was kind of the big wig, to say the least. You would expect him to give prophetic messages to large crowds or dignitaries or just really important people. But in this moment, we see that God is using Elisha to care for the small things, the mundane things, the things that history would say is not important. Because if Elijah doesn't intervene here, this woman would be sold into slavery. And if we're honest, history wouldn't care. History wouldn't talk about this story. This woman becomes a widow and because of her husband's debt gets sold into slavery. That's not something history would concern itself with, but God concerns himself with it. So whatever we're going through, no matter if our problem is big or small, God is concerned about it. But when we're facing situations like economic difficulties, it's real hard sometimes for us to be able to see God's provisions. This is why we got to really look for it. And it's also important, in my opinion, to make sure we look back on to see how God did provide. Because the woman goes alone into her house with her sons. She has this private, intimate moment. And I get the picture that part of what might have been going through her mind is grief and sadness, knowing that their time together may be short-lived, that they may be sold into slavery soon to cover the debt. And so there's a lot of emotions going into her life, but she had no other choice. There wasn't any other opportunity for her. So she followed Elijah's instructions, praying that God would somehow provide a way. Now, that first year of our marriage, I was doing a master's, and I was pretty busy. Part of why I did the master's is I felt like I needed a little bit more schooling to make sure I was prepared to go into the ministry, prepared maybe in quotation marks on that one. But another reason I wanted to do that particular master's is they had what was called a year of mentored ministry. So after I did the year of classes at the university, I went and the university helped me find a church, a ministry that I could join. And every other week I would meet with another pastor to help me work through the issues that I was encountering, to help me, basically he was my mentor, to help me get started in it. So it was a very valuable time for me and important for me to be part of it. But during this time, as I said, I worked at the bank. I was a teller. When I started at the bank, there were 3 full-time tellers and 2 part-time tellers. Since the bank was purchased by another bank, they were reallocating their resources, and that's maybe a fancy way of saying that we're going to close a branch. And they were going to close my branch and get absorbed by another branch. My job wasn't in jeopardy or anything of that nature, but what happened is they put a hiring freeze on my branch. Shortly after that, the other part-time teller decided to quit. Shortly after that, another full-time teller decided to quit. So we were down 1.5 workers, which meant, and we couldn't hire anybody. So the branch manager comes to me and says, Jeff, if you're not in class, you got to work. So I went from 20 hours a week to working any time I didn't have class. So because a lot of my classes were either in the afternoon or evening, I had to open every single day, which is fine. But also meant if I didn't have class in the afternoon or evening, I had to close that day as well because there were only 2 other tellers. So I had to help share the load. And so for that year, I was either in class, being a TA, or working at the bank. And so from 20 hours to 35 to 45 hours some weeks, that was my week in having night classes, being a TA, and trying to care about these freshmen who thought they could change the world. But, I was that way sometime as well. And the reality is my year was just crazy busy and such a blur. And I'll get back to where I'm coming from with that in a minute. So just think about the widow. She's sitting there with her sons, having this moment, shutting the door. She has a flask of oil. They say, now what? So she did what she was told. She followed Elisha's instructions. Her sons would bring her jars, and she would fill them with the oil. And soon every container was filled to the brim. She asked one of her sons, bring me another jar, and he said, there aren't any left. And in that moment, the oil stopped flowing. When she told Elisha what had happened, he said, sell the oil to pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. So she followed the instructions. Again, this may have been like a last-ditch effort to Hail Mary of, I've got nothing else to lose. That might have been the mentality that the widow was experiencing. But she had no other options. But even though she had no other options, I think it's worth noting that the woman acted honorably. There are things she could have done to avoid this situation. She could have found unsavory ways to make money to pay the debt. Now, she might not have liked this, but she may have just ran away. She could have fled the creditors and gone somewhere else, but she didn't. She acted honorably. And we recognize we could file for bankruptcy today. She can't. That's not how the world worked for them. There are other things that we could have, other opportunities, other ways that we could deal with this that the widow didn't have at her disposal. And her honor, the way she acted, stands in stark contrast to the creditors. Remember, they weren't necessarily breaking the law, but they weren't following the spirit or the heart of the law. They were thinking about themselves, of how they could survive, how they could improve. She acted honorably. So she has this moment with her sons. And I just love that moment where she asks for another jar. And that is when the oil stopped flowing. I've always wondered, was there a bit of regret that she ever expressed? If I would have asked that one more person for more jars, I would have had more oil. This is where we get the concept that your limit of God is your limit of blessing. The box you put God in is how you will experience Him. It's the limit of what He will bring into your life. Now, again, it's difficult to quantify the miracles that God is providing for us when they are actually happening. But when the jars were full is when the oil stopped flowing. Your measure of faith is the measure of blessing. That's the reality of God and who He is with us. Now, if you remember, I compared Elisha and Elijah a moment ago. Earlier in Elijah's ministry, in 1 Kings chapter 17, he encounters the widow of Zarephath. And in that, she only has a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. But through God's power, Elijah was able to go to her, and her little bit of flour and her little bit of oil never ran out. So we see that Elijah provides a miracle for a widow, that stuff will never run out, while Elisha provides an abundance. And one of the things I love about this story is that God didn't just provide for the bare minimum. He didn't say, here's how you can cover your debts. Go figure out life. He said, I'm going to cover your debts, and then I'm going to get you going in life. So her and her sons weren't destitute, weren't completely beside themselves. God took care of them. Their problem was removed. No longer was death staring them in the face, but now they had the opportunity for life. Well, that first year of marriage, as I said, we're living in a small apartment, working at the bank and substitute teaching, taking classes. One of the things I look back on that, and I didn't realize it at the time. I realized it at the time, but I didn't realize the miracle that God provided. We didn't have much of any money. We couldn't afford much, but I was able to take my classes and pay cash for them. I didn't have to take out loans to pay for these classes. And I'm looking back, and I don't even know how that worked. I don't know how God made the money work, but I know He did. But another thing I look back on is Hannah and I made a very conscious decision. And that decision was that we weren't going to cheat God. I'd rather take a loan out than cheat God. We made sure we paid our tithe check or offering or whatever you want to call it every time we got paid. And I believe that because we sacrificed for God and said, God, you are important for us, He took care of us. Now, there are times He takes care of us and we still have to take a loan out. That's not my point. My point is the fact of when we live honorably for God, when we get the jars, when we have the faith that He calls us to have, then He's going to make it all work out in the end. Now, I tell that story understanding that my story does not compare to the widow's story. Her life was in jeopardy. Mine wasn't. I recognize there's a gap there. But I'm pretty confident that what you're experiencing, your life isn't in jeopardy. You may not have filet mignon on the table, but you've got food on the table. So what I want to challenge you today is look at the jars in your life. Are you gathering them for God to pour His blessing in there? Because your limit of God is your limit of blessing. Today is January 31st, and if you haven't received your tax documents by now, you should receive them in the next few days. So here's a challenge for you. Take it or leave it. I want to challenge you to get your W-2, 1099s or 1098s, all your interest or whatever, all the income you get, and put it next to your charitable contributions. And look at those. Some of you be like, man, that was a lot of money, but that's God's money. And I sacrificed for Him, and He provided this over here. Some of you are going to be like, I did some, but did it honor God? Some of you are going to be like, well, I don't have any charitable contributions. And I wonder how much we're missing on God's blessing because we're not sacrificing for Him. We're not living honorably for Him. And we're going on we have all these issues, and we're like, God, why aren't you doing anything? He says, just set the jars out. And sometimes they're empty. But God says, I don't care if they're empty. I just need them to be available. So whether you have a lot, whether you have a little, I want to challenge you to be like the widow and say, I have something. God hears what it is. And that's all we can do. Your limit of God is your limit of blessing.